in the residential school system, particularly in relation to what musicians today are saying about that whole experience, how they're engaging with the issues. I attended almost all of the national events of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which, as you know, began in, following the President Harper's apology in 2008. And as you undoubtedly also know, it was a process that was disputed by many. It was not something that was comfortable for many Aboriginal people. They estimate about 50% of survivors probably were willing to testify there. There's been some scholars, such as Métis scholar, art historian David Garneau in Regina, who's described the Truth and Reconciliation process as something like the process of confession in the Catholic Church. And a rather unfortunate analogy that was, considering that the churches were so implicated in some of the abuses in the schools. On the other hand, there have been some very brave people come forward with testimony that will undoubtedly not allow what happened in those schools ever to be forgotten. There will be an archive of documentation that could serve well. As I said, I have been thinking a little bit about the way musicians are engaging with the issues. But some archival research was obviously an important thing to do, and today I'm really focusing on the archival side of things. I haven't put this together quite in this way before because I'm still struggling to understand. Well, you'll see where the struggles are, and you can maybe help me with the understanding. Okay, I already mentioned that this was associated with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission research. I should have mentioned that I was part of a team of researchers co-directed by Kibi Martin at the University of Alberta and Dylan Robinson, who is now at the University of Toronto. Today I'm going to keep coming back to two themes that I've been struggling with in my work. One is how to balance attention to the violence, which we've heard about a lot with the schools, both the governmentally mandated malnutrition programs that made the news, the sexual abuse, which attracts the lawyers, and then many, many kinds of abuse which are harder to prove in the courts and which have had less recognition, physical and psychological abuse of some kinds. I was at one of the residential schools while doing this archival research, and a man came in and said, "I'm trying to find a lawyer, but they won't accept that there is visible evidence, even though my feet are scarred, because every time I tried to run away, they poured boiling water on my feet." But this was not regarded as sufficient visible evidence of abuse. So just one of the moving experiences that affected me. So the violence, we hear a lot about the violence. I myself think, how did those children survive? How are they coping now, generations later? And so I find myself attracted to agency, what little things they could do to help them. But actually, I'm aware of the argument that was made in the 90s, especially by historians, that agency sometimes has served the settler population as a sort of colonialist alibi, that you feel, oh well, they were strong nevertheless, and therefore it couldn't have been all that bad. So this is something that, of course, is a huge problem, and so I still struggle with how to balance these two aspects of things. The other concept that I've been thinking about a lot is the concept of slow violence, which I think is attributable to the ecologist Rob Nixon. And he is more concerned with environmental degradation, but of course slow violence was really a good descriptor for colonialism. And the two are, of course, not unconnected, as everyone in this room knows. I'm still working a little bit with how sonic dimensions that I study can shed some light on slow violence, and we'll get to that in a minute. This is how Rob Nixon describes slow violence, how in an age when the news media venerate the spectacular, when public policy and electoral campaigns are shaped around perceived immediate need, can we convert into image and narrative those disasters that are slow-moving and long in the making, anonymous, starring nobody, attritional, and of indifferent interest to our image-driven world? How can we turn the long emergencies of slow violence into stories striking enough to rouse public sentiment and warrant political intervention? These emergencies whose repercussions have given rise to some of the most serious threats of our time. So as I said, I'm going to focus today a little bit on showing you certain documentary and archival evidence that I think has not been considered very much, with an ear to the sonic. The sonic is emerging in the social sciences as one of the multisensory dimensions that has perhaps been undervalued in scholarship and is now kind of emerging in a big way. And of course it works for me, since that's what I pay attention to. So we have all of these things. We have some, but not a lot, of church policy documents. We have some hymn books, not a lot of printed music, but a little bit. There's lots of residential school newsletters, but of course, in each one of these cases, we're going to think about who had control over the creation of these documents. Photograph collections, extensive photograph collections. Survivor narratives, and I'm going to talk just a bit about, or allude a little bit about, the differences between the pre-TRC survivor narratives and the ones that have been put forward during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which are all available online. There's something like 600 hours of testimony available online. Obviously, the TRC itself shaped the way people could tell their narratives. Everything from the short time limit that people had only 15 minutes, so what would you talk about if you have only 15 minutes, to the fact that the silences of the past about the violence, sexual abuse, etc., that was something that people did want to put on record, so there's been more attention during the TRC to the stories of abuse and violence. And then another set of material is the work of contemporary artists relating to the IRS experience or responding to it. I'm not sure we'll get to that today, but we'll see. I do have a few audio clips if we do get to it. Government documents. While there's things that are relevant, of course, there are government documents that lay out plans for assimilating the indigenous population. The references to sound that occur in a number of documents always relate to exacting obedience from the population. And these always relate to the bells and the buzzers and whatever sonic devices were used to divide up the day. So this is a very bad and small photograph. I don't know whether you can read it, but talks about bells ringing at 6, at 6:30. Another bell calls the bigger girls to help with work in the kitchen and dining room, the bigger boys to help with the work at the barn. At 7, the bells run for breakfast. 7:30, prayers. After prayers, there's again hard labor for the children. And then there's various bells for the various parts of the day. And in the evening, 8:45, no, we're still in the morning there, sorry, okay. So in the evening then, of course, there's also bells for evening study, choir practice, lights out, and going to bed. Many survivors talk about how oppressive they found this constant ringing of bells and this constant regimentation of their life at the schools. Basil Johnson, the well-known author of Indian School Days, is one of the most eloquent, he's a fine writer, about this. And he links very directly the bells to management, obedience, conformity, dependence, subservience, uniformity, docility, and surrender. At another point in that book, he talks about the black book and the bells being the two biggest tools of oppression in the schools. Nonetheless, the schools were quite proud of their bells, and they frequently took pictures of them. That's all there is to say about that. There are some other government documents that are quite interesting. Isabel Knockwood found a document that was instructions to teachers, probably at the Shubenacadie School in Nova Scotia. And this is by far from the whole document. It's quite an interesting document, but these three things seem pertinent to things I was talking about today. First of all, reading, I mean, this says something about expectations of voice. I think that's why I was interested. Not only should pupils be taught to read distinctly, but then there's this kind of racist idea that they're expected to mumble inaudibly or shout in spasmodic fashion. Who would put that into instructions in teachers? The instructions for vocal music are pretty clear: simple songs and hymns. The themes of the former to be interesting and patriotic, the tunes bright and cheerful. And then finally, the general item at the very end of these instructions I found interesting. The unnecessary use of textbooks is to be avoided, and do not classify students in advance of their ability. Again, a patronizing statement that had some influence. About those tunes, bright and cheerful, Isabel Knockwood again had some response of her own, talking about how they had to keep singing about Christopher Columbus, who apparently discovered America when he was lost on his way to find spices further east. And then more confusingly, as she says, they had to sing Columbus sailed across the sea and found this land for you and me, to one of the patriotic, bright and cheerful tunes. So she has some shrewd things to say about this curriculum. There are other government documents that are harder to find, but one of them is a propaganda video that was produced in the 1950s. This is online, so I don't know whether have you discovered this before. I think I'd like to take time to play it for you. It's obviously at a point where the criticism of the schools was starting to build, and the government wanted to suggest that the education that was being offered was on a par with other educational systems. And again, talking about bright and cheerful tunes, I've not identified the music soundtrack. There's some music people here. If anybody else knows what the music is, let me know. I did look into a few possible sources, but it doesn't work out.
North of Hudson Bay, James Bay, and at the southern tip of James Bay, the settlement of Moose Factory. News Magazine salutes Education Week with films of an Indian residential school, 500 miles north of Toronto. Principal Eric Barrington dispenses first aid among his many other duties. He heads one of Canada's 69 Indian residential schools, scattered in key locations as far north as the Arctic Circle. They have a total of 11,000 pupils, orphans, convalescents, those who live too far in the wilderness to get to a daily school. They learn not only games and traditions, such as the celebration of St. Valentine's Day, but the mastery of words, which will open to them the whole range of the ordinary Canadian curriculum. Children who live with the midnight sun in their summer holidays, an explanation. They come to school in September, go home for holidays in June. Instead of the isolation and neglect of the past, a free and equal chance for children in urban centers.
Had to get the bell in there.
A service begins each day. The school is conducted by the Church of England, though it's maintained, like other Indian schools, by the Federal Department of Indian Affairs. For the oldest Canadians, a new future.
One of the things that interests me is how each of these kinds of sources cast the picture differently. The very mostly smiling faces of the children in this video you rarely find in the still photo evidence, as you'll see in a short while. Okay, a second type of sources are printed materials. And I wanted to speak just briefly about hymn books that are used, because the hymn books themselves have a much longer history than the Indian residential schools. The relationship with clergy when people were still living on the land was quite varied, as many of you will know. Sometimes Christianity was resisted, sometimes there was partial confession, pretended confession, syncretic forms of spirituality that emerged. So a wide variety of relationships existed with the clergy. But hymns were an interesting phenomenon in that, first of all, sometimes hymns were syncretic. There could be a traditional melody that had Christian words inserted to it, or vice versa. There could be a folk song that could be taught with these Christian words. And in many cases, the older hymn books, and I've heard this all from Innu people in Labrador as well, that the oldest hymn books that are still in use were thought to be ones where most of the hymns were made by the Innu people. So there were those kinds of things. You have here not an Innu man, but an Ojibwe man who some will recognize, Augustine Shingwok. I don't know why I didn't label put his name on there, who was a great chief in northern Ontario in the Sault Ste. Marie area, Garden River First Nation. And he actually was one of the Aboriginal leaders who wanted residential schools because he felt that Aboriginal children needed to learn literacy skills primarily. But he wanted the schools to also reflect Aboriginal teaching. And so his vision was of this dual kind of educational system. People today and in the schools still remember him through a hymn that I didn't bring the translation, but the point about this hymn is that the English translation is quite different from the Ojibwe, and that the Ojibwe refers constantly to the metaphor of a pine tree. Shingwok translates as pine tree. And so in a way this hymn was for many of the Ojibwe speakers a kind of tribute to the kind of leadership that they were hoping would have emerged within the schools. I'll play just a little bit of it. It's been recorded by one of the families who was his descendant on a recent CD. So I guess what I wanted to say then, that sometimes the printed materials were valued by Indigenous families to a great extent, and that sometimes there were specific hymns that had quite deep meaning for them. There isn't a lot of other printed music in archives that I have looked in so far. The archives relating to this are so extensive that there may be more than I've yet found. Sometimes there would be things like Christmas carol books. Sometimes there's a round that was intended for girl guides. So teachers, I think, were on their own resources as to whether they dug up some additional material. Some of them were quite proficient musicians and wrote out tunes and wrote out pieces that they taught. And probably they composed, some of the teachers composed them. School newsletters are a somewhat different story. Here we have an incredibly rich array of resources. And I don't know whether any of you is there anybody in the room that has been reading some of these newsletters from the schools? They've been at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They've had quite a lot of them available, and then I've been able to find many, many more in archival sources. It's interesting that, as far as I can tell, they didn't emerge again until the 1940s. And I think, again, they were a little bit of a propaganda tool, that this was a way of putting some information out about what was going on, and it was invariably positive, what was told in these schools. The sections were usually written by the students, but some of the students in TRC hearings have talked about how someone was there telling them more or less what to write. So it's hard to evaluate this information. It's not that it's completely untrue. I think we find out some things about the events of the schools. We find out some of the silly and imaginative things that the kids did to have a good time, which is again nice to see that there may have been moments like that. But I've just put a couple of images up here. I'll have to say I think the best newsletters came from the Grey Nuns in Quebec. They really did a fine job, and I find that the cultural life of the schools is talked about in an expansive way there. There's one about a sleigh ride. There's many about particular liturgical events in the course of the year. So the one on the right is about a particular Feast of the Assumption. The Feast of the Assumption, as some of you will know, is August 15th, and that has become, for Catholic Aboriginal people, a really important day that continues to play an important role in the life of communities. Some of these things, again, had longer histories before the schools and certainly have continuities into the present day. There's one on the left here about a program that happened when visitors had come, and another one, I can't remember what I put up here, about a feast day. Here's one that occurred. I was going to put a picture beside it, but I see I forgot to do that. This one was not from the Grey Nuns, but a later one from 1969, about a rare instance of a rock band coming, or at least we think it was either a country or a rock band, according to the instruments. So there were some events that enabled the kids to dance and to probably hear some of the popular music that they were craving to listen to. But the newsletters are rich sources of information, but definitely, there was definitely an agenda, there was definitely a kind of style and a reason for their existence. Photo collections. Photo collections are extensive. There's private ones, there's of course ones that were official ones. This is one that I think is kind of semi-official. It's not quite so staged as some of them. The kids look a little bit real, and they're not all wearing uniforms. So it's kind of interesting to see the differences in what seem to be the facial expressions depending on the context in which the photos were shot. More often, there's more photos of this sort, where you see small groups of uniformed children or youth very often playing musical instruments. From my point of view, I find this one interesting, that it seems that the young women were taught to play in mandolin orchestras, the young men were taught to play in brass bands, pretty much. So there was a gendered division of the musical instruction that mirrored a gendered expectations about sound in the dominant society. The bands, I want to say a word or two about the bands. Like Christianity, the tradition of band playing, and especially brass band playing, had a much longer history than the residential schools. There has been, most of the work that's been done on this has been done in British Columbia, where there was a really, really thriving brass band culture in the Aboriginal communities. And Susan Nayland has written about the fact that the way the bands were organized within communities mirrored the clan structures of the community itself. And so there were obligations, there were certain families who had to have certain positions in the band. And we know that these bands played in communities for all sorts of local events. They played when men from the cannery came back home on the coastal boats. They played for Dominion Day celebrations and for certain imperial functions, but they also played for community events of various sorts. So it's not surprising that for the boys in particular, that the bands in the residential school actually felt a little bit familiar, or at least for many of them. And even in the TRC testimony, one of the things that has come up about sound in the testimony are people stating that band practices were one of the things that saw them through. One of the commissioners, Wilton Littlechild, said hockey and the band were the two things that he thought saved his life in the residential schools. So these were, for many people, one of the things that were more pleasant. One on the school steps. There were also private lessons, and the newsletters talk a little bit about how many people were taking lessons at one time or another. And this was undoubtedly the case for at least some of the children. Which children were picked to take lessons, it's a little hard to kind of fathom exactly how those divisions were made. But one girl from Shinwalk School in Northern Ontario said, I should have had this quote pulled up for you. Oh yes, I put it there. You felt validated in a way that you were a person. One of the few instances where there was a one-on-one relationship with a teacher, and so some of these private lessons were probably quite important for the kids. On the other hand, there are some stories such as they made you sing in the choir if you've done something bad. So there was a variety of attitudes toward it by both the teachers and the children, I think. A variety of attitudes about what musical participation meant in the schools. There were, of course, processions for various religious occasions, such as the Feast of the Assumption. It's interesting, I've talked to a number of survivors and I've asked them about religious processions, and some remember them vividly and others not at all. So variable experiences and variable practices, I'm sure. In some cases, the residential schools were quite close to communities. And so at times there were gatherings of the community at the school itself. As we know, this was not the norm, that for the most part children were taken quite far away, and some of them didn't get home at all in the summer. Some did. Some parents were close enough that they were able occasionally to visit, but the isolation from families was more the norm than this particular picture represents. I put these two up here because there was an incredible amount of ethnic stereotyping going on in all of the programming in the schools. And there were children who were performing in blackface, for instance, children who played the roles of someone who spoke a different language, and invariably ethnic dance, such as these young women are doing. So it was a period of time where I think we need to understand more about how expressive culture was implicated in the stereotyping of many different specific cultures, not simply Aboriginal culture. But one of the things that happened in many of the schools was a kind of self-parody, that the children were required to play Indian. And guess who they were? And so all of the stereotypes in B-rated movies and cowboys and Indians flicks, all of those kinds of things were played out. This one is one that indicates a, particularly violent implements in the hands of the boys. At the same time, I can't help but notice that these boys look happier than the boys in some of the other pictures. The very fact that they got to be strong people of whatever sort, or maybe that they got to imitate movies, it's hard to know what might have gone through their heads. But I know my mouth fell open when I came across this and many other pictures of playing Indian. But there may be a more complicated story about how those activities were received. Traditional music in the schools in general, along with language, was not allowed. However, there are pictures that, again, I think this is still in the category of ethnic stereotype, if I'm not mistaken. The girls taught to have this pose with their arms folded at the back of the picture. What seems to be drums, but no particular type of drum that I would know would have been used in communities there, although these drums are dressed with cloths around the outside the way certain Ojibwe big drums would have been dressed during that time. They look a bit more like snare drums, kind of dressed up to be Indian drums, I think. So hard to read certain pictures. I put that in just to demonstrate that there was to some extent documentation of games and crafts at the schools. plays and pageants, although again, different points of view. One student in the 1930s talked about hating the Christmas pageants because the white people would laugh when they made a mistake. So if they were, again, representing kind of lack or representing somehow inadequacy, these experiences could be part of the trauma rather than part of the pleasure. There were, in some of the schools, especially by the 1960s, more music and dances that were recreational activities. The schools were starting to improve their standards in many places, and they were quite uneven. So we can't talk about the schools in a way. We should be talking about specific schools, and I'm as much at fault here today for generalizing as anyone. But I found these interesting. There was quite a nice representation of the boys and the girls getting together, which in general we read about was not a very common occurrence on the right-hand side. And on the left-hand side, you can guess it, those are Beatles imitators. So I don't know who the kids are, but they put on long hair, I guess a little too long there, but they were trying to imitate the Beatles. And then there's, of course, some unexpected pictures. As the students who are here from my class know, I like Philip Deloria's work on Indians in unexpected places, where he says that often our ideas about indigenous cultures can be productively disrupted when we find the unexpected. I'm not too sure what to make of the productive disruptions here, but on the left we have a full headdress, but dark-suited young man. But right next to him is someone playing the clarinet, undoubtedly a member of the band. But exactly how these individuals fit together, we'd have to think that one through, and we don't have any more evidence. On the right is not a very good film, but I don't know, can you tell what those young women are wearing?
It's like a mitre.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so the bishop's mitre hat. So again, a kind of semblance of the power figures within the school. Did they do that for fun? Who knows? The photographs are so void of a lot of explanation at times. I'll turn a little bit to agency, and here I draw a little bit on the archival, the interviews with survivors, a little bit also on some of the interviews I've done with a few people. This is Sister Dorothy Moore, who went to the Shubenacadie School in Nova Scotia. She was physically abused there for 2 years, and her parents took her out of that school, sent her to a different boarding school where she was allowed to speak Mi'kmaq, and where, in fact, she had quite a pleasant experience. So her story is one of the ones that tells me that the residential school system was systemic violence. There was no question. It wasn't just occasional incidents of people who were doing bad things, but violence of various sorts and abuse was condoned within that system in a way that it was not seemingly being practiced even at other boarding schools. But anyway, she talks about the one thing that was important for her, able to draw her home. And she could even draw the rooms. She knew then, you know, that this was family. And of course, drawing in the dirt with a stick was safe because you could erase that very quickly if the wrong authority came by at some point. There are some stories among the older survivor narratives about traditional knowledge being used for survival. Henry Morrow, who taught at Shingwak in the late 1940s, just talks about a boy from Saskatchewan who whistled down the Northern Lights, which is the locale where the spirits of ancestors were to live. So he did this because he wanted to convince the priests that the ancestors were stronger than the priests. He probably suffered for doing that. We don't know the rest of the story. There's various stories about children listening for birdsong. Birdsong also carries the voices of ancestors, and that was one way. The nice thing about sound in general, and I say this to students all the time, that I think sound's properties are quite interesting in that it crosses borders. It cannot be confined in a certain space. it comes to you. It's not something that you exert on the world. And all of those features of sound as one of our senses, I think, became important for these children, so that birdsong could be like a message from the outside world that could cross the boundaries of these imposing buildings that they were staying in. And then, of course, there's the issue of language. And there's many quotes. I've put only one on this slide, but there's many quotes about how the grounds, especially outside in the schools, often were large enough that the children would find places where they could speak their own language. And a couple of survivors talk about the fact that they could continue to think in their own language. So silent use of the language became an important bit of survival. I like, Jerry Elford wrote a song called Residential School, in which he talks about how he was not allowed to speak his language, but then he has a long section in his language. So it's a kind of like a, wasn't allowed, but hey, didn't stop the continuation of that, of his language skills. Songs change meaning in the hands of the children, and this story, again from Shingwak, I spent several days there, so I have, and they had bodies of interviews with survivors from the 40s and 50s that were a kind of window on that period of time that I didn't find in too many other places. But this one was a great story from someone who first heard Don't Fence Me In. I think it's a Nat King Cole song originally. And the kids would sing it over and over again. It was just a pop song, but of course it wasn't just a pop song. I've used a couple of these slides in another talk, forgive me if you've seen them before, but there were instances of parody. This particular one comes from the Mushhole School at Six Nations Reserve in Ontario, and maybe it was the food there that gave rise to the name of the school, but they took There Is a Happy Land Far, Far Away and changed the words to There's a Boarding School Far, Far Away where we get mush and milk 3 times a day. Elizabeth Graham published this little excerpt on the back of her book on the schools, and so far I haven't found a longer versions of it, but I haven't really looked that hard either, so it may be there. Isabel Knockwood talks also about some of the ways that hymns could be parodied, and she, this story is a very clever one, where a Latin hymn for benediction reminded this student of a Mi'kmaq, or at least she was able to put Mi'kmaq words to it that sounded roughly, the vowel sounds work all right. So she shouted, or she sang at the top of her voice, the Mi'kmaq phrase that means when the old man went up and farted. So there were some clever examples of children's agency, finding often humorous ways. Nicknames were another one. Many ways to somehow assert their agency in spite of the limited opportunities they had. Isabel talks about being giggling in places where you couldn't be heard, so it was important to contain your laughter, but still you could laugh. So I've been trying to make sense of some of these sorts of things, and I go back to that idea of slow violence to see if the sonic dimensions of what happens over long periods of time somehow can help us understand a little bit of what's going on there. This slide is too small to read, perhaps, but maybe you can see it. I realized after I did it, but I haven't had time to change it, that I probably was wrong in making the red to pink, it's too linear. The red to pink lines look as if Aboriginal culture was weakening through this period. There were forces that were trying to make it weaker, but there were also some moments of resurgence within that. And I made the blue section that was basically the government and church leagues looking as if they were getting stronger, but that's definitely too oversimplified. We know, for instance, that there were periods where there was more, and places where there was more community interaction, not control exactly, but some interaction. And so it wasn't a straight line. But we could easily see that the government assimilation, genocide policies were related to control. The sonic analogs are the bells, the simple tunes, the orderly bands that for the instructors represented precision and obedience. For the kids, as I said, maybe something else. We could see some of the syncretic Aboriginal and Christian beliefs coming out in the way certain hymns were regarded, only certain hymns, in some of those uses of traditional sound sources by the children to relate to the external world, in their way of listening for natural sound in particular that might have had some cultural meaning for them that would help sustain them. We could see the Christian church's soul-saving activities coming out in kind of strange ways in those newsletters that were like the facade of fun at the schools, the overdrawing of cultural activities, and the instances of self-parodying that come into many of the photographs. And the children's limited capacity for resistance relates to several of those things, as well as to some of the parodies and the new words for songs that could create some double meanings for them. So I guess what I'm trying to work toward here, and I don't think I've done it yet, but I'm trying to work toward thinking about the way the institutions and the families are embedded within a larger system that would help us see the mechanisms of slow violence in more detail, because it's not simply a couple of words that seem to capture what went on, but I think that the institutional shape of it all is something that we really need to think about. And of course, surrounding all of this is is attitudes about who is human, who is racialized in what way, all of those concepts that underpinned what allowed these schools to be created in the first place.